One of the really important aspects of the regime of American childhood, if you will, is psychiatric labeling. So that means labeling children with a mental health disorder for various thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. This is a very important phenomenon that I think as a society we haven't really had a lot or many very probing and honest conversations about, in part because it's difficult to do so, and because various professional authorities, for better or worse, have held a sort of monopoly on sense-making over them. It's really important to highlight the scale of this phenomenon. So something like 1 in 5 American children are diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. And I think even that statistic actually massively understates the scale of this phenomenon because virtually every American child is under some degree of threat of being labeled with one. And I don't think that this is an American phenomenon at all. I think it's increasingly a global phenomenon. In this video, I want to explore kind of two main aspects of this. First, I want to talk about where this comes from and situate it within the larger kind of social context and talk about like what is driving it. And then I want to talk about how it actually affects the kids that it's done to, because this is really important, I think, because it can then point to what it might look like for us to actually heal and kind of really like take our destiny into our own hands coming out of this kind of thing. Just a really quick disclaimer here. This video is not professional advice of any kind. I am not a mental health professional, and this is not mental health advice. And another thing to keep in mind is that this is not to say that nobody benefits from a psychiatric disorder. Some people certainly appreciate it, and this is, of course, a very complicated and very nuanced topic with a lot of ambiguity, I would say. And so this is really just to kind of share some key points that I think have been very much neglected in the broader discussion. So first, exploring where this phenomenon of psychiatric labeling comes from. I think that it's basically rooted in some different social, institutional, and psychological factors. First of all, this practice of widespread psychiatric labeling of children comes down to some core assumptions. And I think the most core assumption comes down to, do you believe that the fundamental, as I'm calling it, the regime of American childhood is fundamentally adequate and good at its core? Do you believe that it fundamentally serves children's needs reasonably well? Or do you think that it is a failure to a great degree? And I would say that the psychiatric labeling phenomenon comes out of an assumption that that regime of American childhood and the schooling that it involves, the ways that we raise children, it comes from an assumption that it is fundamentally good, or at least that it is on balance good. And when you assume this, naturally you think that when kids display certain emotional states and behaviors, then you think that there's some kind of problem that resides within them. And so naturally then it makes sense, or it makes more sense to say that these kids have some kind of a psychiatric disorder. That's why the people who are in charge of these environments and fundamentally believe in them and support them often work hand in hand with psychiatry. And the psychiatrists and mental health professionals themselves also tend to believe in the fundamental goodness of these environments, like most families, like the ways that we tend to raise children, and our basic modern schooling methodology. And I think that's basically part of the kind of core assumptions of their profession, right? They're not asking very kind of deep probing questions about the nature of your average family or the school system. No, they tend to just kind of defer to whoever is in charge of those systems and then basically give them what they want with regard to managing children. If, on the other hand, you believe that this regime of American childhood is not fundamentally good and adequate, then you would see psychiatric labeling as probably on balance a means of control and a way basically to get children to adapt to toxic environments, to environments that are basically bad for them. You wouldn't fundamentally see the psychiatric labeling of children as something that really helps them, because you would see that it doesn't actually deal or it doesn't actually assist them with the real problems that they're facing, which has to do with how they're being shaped by the toxic environments that they're stuck in. And the fundamental quality of these environments that are shaping kids seems like something really important to explore. Maybe like the most important thing to explore, as a society, as a population, certainly as parents. It just seems like something really important to explore, but we don't really explore it. I don't think we explore it very deeply or in a very kind of probing way. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is the prevalence of basically state-dictated education. So in general, parents basically are pressured by the state to have their kids be educated in a certain way, and they don't have a whole lot of meaningful say in that. Parents, right? They mostly just have to accept that, and so they're not really incentivized to ask big questions around, well, is this actually the right thing for the kid? Mostly, they just face tremendous pressure to basically get their kids to adapt to that system. The other, I would say, has to do with the power of expert authority when it comes to these issues. So I think for the most part, there's a kind of, there's a certain unspoken assumption that when it comes to how children are raised, this is an issue that experts decide. So it's not something for us as lay people, us as parents, or even us as like individual kids to really be thinking about. It's not really our prerogative. It's the prerogative of experts. And so we're trained not to really trust ourselves around these things, not to really develop our own perspectives and goals around them, but basically just to kind of defer to what the experts say and then essentially blame ourselves for the negative results of their leadership. And the most important reason why I think we aren't having these discussions around the nature of how we are managing and shaping the young population is because we haven't really looked at how we were shaped. For the most part, we don't really do that. We don't like to do that because it's painful, it's deeply personal, it's very difficult. Doing so successfully could mean a period of personal crisis and confusion, and maybe we don't know where to find guidance and support for really dealing with that. And so instead, we just don't really become conscious of that, and we just continue to shape kids more or less the way we were shaped. Or maybe we shift things a little bit, but we keep a lot of the things the same. So in other words, having these kind of discussions can feel and can be very threatening. So overall, it makes sense that we're not really going to deal with the root issues, and instead we're just going to label children with a psychiatric disorder and say that we're helping them. One of the real eye-openers for me was, as an adult, discovering an entire literature out there that talked about all of these things and basically like kind of exposed the nature of these practices and our kind of parenting and schooling methodologies. And it really helped me shed this idea that these environments were for our own good and that they were so wonderful. So it was authors like John Holt, John Taylor Gatto, Bruce Levine, and many others. And so where does psychiatric labeling come in? Well, typically it gets imposed on the kids that much of the time are very sensitive to what is going on. They're sensitive to these real issues, and they have a certain degree of awareness of them. And the adults who haven't really looked at these things, who don't want to look at these things, find this very threatening. And rather than becoming more conscious, because they don't have a way to do that, that's not a habit that they've developed, they will then basically bring in these tools like psychiatric labeling. and then they'll label the kid. So for those of us labeled with ADHD, for example, what do we really need? Well, maybe we need to be able to spend more time being active outside. Maybe we need more say in the things that we do, in the tasks that we choose, in the topics that we choose to learn about. Maybe we need to not be dumbed down and infantilized. Maybe we need our humanity to be respected better. Maybe we need our family environments to become massively, massively more aware. Instead, we have these teachers who are managing us, who themselves are typically under the very tight control of that system, and who certainly aren't going to be able to kind of nurture our full selves, nurture our real development. And we're often trapped in family environments that are often very toxic and very unaccountable for this. And so this all massively, massively shapes our emotional and psychological development. And when early on, when we come out of it, we probably have no idea what to do about this. We're not seeing what happened to us with clarity, and we maybe don't have a lot of guidance for that. And so my focus has really been on like, well, what does it look like to then give ourselves what we needed? You know, some people call that like reparenting. I just think it's about like getting back on that path of like really reconnecting with yourself and sort of engaging in a process of like self-definition. And so that's a lot of what this channel is about. But so what this phenomenon of psychiatric labeling does, among other things, is it basically creates people who don't know who they are. They're disconnected from themselves. They're disconnected from their sense of purpose. And then, you know, what they're really meant to contribute to society basically gets lost. Now, another aspect of this is like, sure, maybe we are having some real problems, right? Like maybe there's some kind of maladaptive behaviors or self-destructive behaviors. Maybe we're suffering a lot emotionally. Maybe we're having like really, you know, chaotic mental and emotional states. But the question is this best understood as a medical problem? Or is it just like a rational response to what's going on? Because when we say it's a medical problem, we really are disregarding the issues with the environment. Now, I know psychiatry and the mental health system today says, oh no, we have a biopsychosocial model. But to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're adequately dealing with what is going on, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that labeling people with a disorder does more good than harm. Now, some kids really understand the betrayal that all of this is, and naturally that produces a pretty strong emotional reaction. But then that further becomes medicalized, and it becomes like almost a further proof of like, wow, see, we really were right that this person has a medical problem. So all of these kind of misinterpretations and like mismanagement of the problem can just make it more and more acute. Now, how does this actually shape the kids that it's done to? I've touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to go more deeply into it now. I think fundamentally it's basically the destruction of authentic identity. We have these authentic responses to our toxic environments. The environment basically doesn't like those reactions. It doesn't want to actually consider what they might mean. And so we get labeled with a disorder. So it's basically a certain kind of authoritarian control masquerading as behavioral health care. And so this basically just disconnects us from our own inner compass, from our own real perspective. So like for example, instead of seeing that maybe our family environment is toxic, maybe seeing that like, wow, I'm actually surrounded by people that are kind of miserable to be around, which would be a very challenging and difficult thing to realize, particularly if they're your closest family members. Instead of being able to really come to terms with that, we instead think, oh no, for example, we have a problem with irritability due to our defective body chemistry. Or instead of this method of education that's being forced onto me is kind of dehumanizing and disgusting, we then get brainwashed into thinking, oh no, I maybe have a neurological disorder. And so developing that clear understanding of the circumstances of our lives so that we can figure out what to do about them is something that gets radically thwarted by this process of psychiatric labeling. And so all of this, not just psychiatric labeling, but sort of the whole child management system that's involved here, basically involves blaming kids for things that really should be attributed to the environment. And so we grow up with a lot of toxic shame. We grow up blaming ourselves for the results of things that were done to us because we were essentially scapegoated by the environment. And, early on, this is really challenging because that kind of toxic shame can be just like so overwhelming, right? We don't know what to do about it. And I feel confident in saying that, it's very possible to really kind of remove all of that stuff. Like, I don't feel plagued by that anymore at all, right? Occasionally an artifact will come up here and there. I mean, things come up in life. But that kind of like really dense layer of it just isn't there for me anymore. And it was intense for a long period of time. So in that sense, I do think that there's hope. And so we grew up basically blaming ourselves because we were brainwashed to do so, blaming ourselves for the effects of what were done to us, rather than just seeing how we were shaped. Because I think that like once we have a better understanding of how we were massively shaped by our environment, which all children are, then we can get a better sense of really how to kind of take our own destiny into our own hands. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because very often what will happen is if, for example, we start to really talk about these things and start to address them, then people who themselves are in denial of them still and have not looked at how they were shaped will basically like project onto us ideas like, oh, we're just being victims. We're not taking responsibility for our own lives. But actually, I think it's the opposite. It's like when you can really look at these things and you're no longer in denial of them, that then becomes kind of the entry point for thinking about what your future might really look like, right? And I think that this really gets to the core of what was taken from us and like how we were negatively affected by these things and then what it means to kind of like reclaim what we lost, right? So we lose that real sense of like what's going on for us within our environment and within our own lives. So for example, like in the school system, right? Maybe that understanding that this kind of method of education is really problematic, maybe then by recognizing that, we can then become clued into something like, well, but then that means that maybe I really want to kind of, massively develop myself intellectually and socially. And I become aware of that because I'm clear that the school system is really not doing that for me. So this is kind of how like reconnecting with those things can kind of reconnect us with like a sense of purpose, right? Or for example, in our family environment, if we realize, well, the people that we're surrounded by are kind of insufferable, then maybe that means like I want to figure out what it means to actually have good relationships, right? Maybe I want to even like develop the sense that it's possible to find better people out there, that they even exist. So basically like this psychiatric labeling phenomenon, at least as I'm describing it, becomes something where like it robs us of our sense of purpose and our sense of direction in life. And so if we actually deal with them, then we can meaningfully reclaim that. And one last thing that I'll touch on here, which relates to how this phenomenon shapes us, is because it creates so much toxic shame, it can then like put us into this like very acute sort of survival state where it's just like strong hypervigilance because we think that something's wrong with us and we need to then survive within that environment. And this can be very destabilizing, and it can really like hurt our ability to navigate through life, to navigate socially, to make good decisions, to respond to life rather than react. So that kind of gets to one of the ways where like this phenomenon can be actually more like, I mean, it's really abusive overall, but that kind of gets to sort of maybe the darker side of it, though it's certainly all dark. And so overall, I think that this process is really about like reclaiming that native perspective that we had as kids. And my experience has been that it's not entirely something that we can do with our heads. I think it's probably primarily not. At least that's been my experience. Certainly, it can be helpful to like find resources that are validating. It can be helpful to kind of understand intellectually better what happened. But at the end of the day, I think that like this is a process that is much more, I would say, within our bodies. You know, it's like when we reconnect with our gut feelings and we reconnect with what our bodies are doing, then the story is able to kind of emerge naturally. So these are some of my thoughts on this issue of the psychiatric labeling of kids and why I think that it does more harm than good, at least in many cases. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please do share it with anybody who you think it might be relevant for. I think that it's really important that the people who need this kind of information, need these resources, get it, because sometimes it can be hard to find. Please also subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end, and I look forward to having you for the next one.